The pathogen that I was assigned was Clostridium botulinum, and I thought this was a little interesting that I was assigned this because I have had treatment via Botox, not like what you think, but for the contractility of my muscles, because I do have a disease, or actually a disorder of the muscle, in which I've been able to have Botox treatment to paralyze the contracting muscles and spasms. And also, I'm a big canned food advocate. We actually can our own food, me and my husband, so I thought it was interesting I got this pathogen. So a little bit about Clostridium botulinum. It is a gram-positive bacteria. It's rod-shaped and it's also spore forming. So we talked a lot about endospores in our course of study, and endospores allow the pathogen to survive environmental factors such as pH, so some of these pathogens can survive the acidity of our stomach, temperature, and a lot of other things that would normally destroy microbiota because of the extremity. So that's why it's really important when we're talking about Clostridium botulinum we talked about boil time in our course of study. So with things such as green beans or things that come from soil, this is actually one I canned, you want to make sure that you're boiling it for more than 15 minutes because things such as Clostridium botulinum, the optimal growth is 38 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. But in order to make this safe to eat, you need to reach over 212 degrees Fahrenheit to kill the endospores. So people who like to can, like myself, we have something like a pressure cooker. I don't know if you can see this, but on this it's got that little cap on top. That's the weights, and if you add more weight on top of the pressure canner, it's going to increase the pressure and the temperature and kill pathogens such as Clostridium botulinum. So it's really important you do it right. Clostridium botulinum is an obligate anaerobe, so it does not necessarily need oxygen. Again, it's found in the soil or water, just anywhere, honestly. There's a lot of isolated colonies that you can find. I mean, even on our food, like if I wanted to can this squash, there's nothing about it that's acidic or it doesn't have a hypertonic solution that's going to keep things such as such as Clostridium botulinum or any other soil pathogens from growing. So a lot of times you'll see things like jelly. We just boil bathe them because you don't need extra pressure to kill the bacteria. It's already got a lot of sugar in there that's going to create a hypertonic solution. So bacterium such as Clostridium botulinum doesn't grow. So it normally exists in the intestines of humans and also animals, and it produces a potent neurotoxin. So Clostridium botulinum in itself is not necessarily toxic. I mean, it is, but what it does is the endospore, and once it comes out of its vegetative state, is going to create that neurotoxin that actually causes the harm. So as far as transmission, normally, like I said, there's a little in our GI tract, but competition between the normal microbiota and other things that are in there that wouldn't necessarily make us sick keeps them at bay. Probably the most cases of transmission you would see in infants in the USA, and then canned goods by ingestion. The USA is pretty big on eating canned foods. You probably see a lot of these in the store, so that's the kind you buy versus like the kind that people out here in the West would actually can. A lot of people don't hear about that on the East Coast because they don't really can like that. They think it's crazy when a case of botulism comes into the hospital. So again, it's mostly seen in infants and then by canned foods by ingestion, and I'll explain a little more during the signs and symptoms what you might see. The other two that are very rare are wound and inhalation spores, or inhalation of the spores. So you'd find that in dust, dirt, cutting oneself on a can lid. So opening this guy, if this was not canned properly and contained the pathogen, Clostridium botulinum, and you cut yourself while opening this, that's one way it could get into a wound. So it first has to be infected, or have Clostridium botulinum, and then you would have to cut yourself. So that's extremely rare. And then the cases of inhalation were actually only found in laboratory workers that we have on record. And then another type is injection for therapeutic use. So when I had to get my injections in my hip for my dystonia and the muscle spasms, they had to warn me about the symptoms of the neurotoxin, because that's exactly what it is. And I'll explain a little bit of that mechanism of action. So the actual pathogen of Clostridium botulinum is 2 to 10 micrometers, and it only takes 1 microgram to kill a human. So I got the information from eMedicine on medscape.com. So some of the signs and symptoms, again, Clostridium botulinum has a neurotoxin. It's normally protected by proteins that are non-toxic to the human, so that's why it can survive in your GI tract. However, once the neurotoxin is released, it remains it remains in the neuromuscular junction and prevents the release of neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So you'd see this happen. The neurotoxin will bind to something called the peripheral cholinergic synapses. I've seen it called snake receptors, but for this purpose I'll just call it peripheral synapses or synapses. The neurotoxin prevents the muscle from actually contracting, so symptoms in kind of a long case of botulism would lead to flaccid paralysis, so the muscles would not contract. So in my case with dystonia, where I was having contractions, you can actually see some in my hand, I do have contractions, and they won't release. Doctors will actually put botulism into my muscles to have that neurotoxin bind to my peripheral synapse and make it so my muscles cannot contract. So somebody who doesn't intend to have this is going to see flaccid paralysis. They're not going to be able to move around too well. So early signs, flaccid paralysis doesn't happen for a little bit. The actual early signs are the person's going to feel weak and dizzy. This is going to happen 1 to 3 days after consuming contaminated food. They're going to have blurred vision, dilated pupils, dry mouth, constipation, and abdominal pain. So somebody who's had a contaminated food source is probably going to write this off as food poisoning, essentially. However, the later signs are weakness in the peripheral muscles, like I explained, the flaccid paralysis, and some can unfortunately have respiratory paralysis, and that leads to death, and that's pretty serious. Complete recovery of this, again, because it does bind to those synapses and it destroys the nerve endings. Complete recovery is actually going to take months to years until the effective nerve damage or nerve endings can regrow. So the mortality rate back in the day when canned goods were more popular. That's not to say we don't have it now, but kind of in the 70s, 60s, the mortality rate was 70%. They kind of didn't expect this to be showing up in the ER. However, we're a little more educated about it now, and the mortality rate is 5 to 10%. And again, this is the most common is going to be infant botulism. So as far as diagnosis, they do it by the toxin activity. The neurotoxin that I've been talking about is what they're going to be looking for in the serum, the feces, gastric fluids, and it's usually found fairly early in the disease. So if you're not sure that it's quite food poisoning, they're going to test for toxin activity. Again, infant botulism is the highest kind of botulism you'd see in the US. This is why we tell people not to feed children, particularly under 6 months. It's recommended under 1 year, not to consume things like honey, milk powder. Even they can get botulism by inhaling dust and spores. They're just that much more sensitive because they've not developed the immune system much like adults have already. So the first recognition of infant botulism was in 1976, again during that peak time for it, and it's most common in the USA. Like I explained, adults have the competitive bowel microbes, so only 1 to 2% of those infants have died from the infant botulism. The only difference in symptoms with infant botulism is they're going to cry, obviously, because they're probably having abdominal pain, but the one that you do see is failure to thrive. Wound botulism develops from the toxin production in contaminated wounds. So it's really identical to the foodborne disease, but it's going to take more time because it's got a greater distance to travel. And it kind of avoids the GI tract, so you're going to see more of that paralysis in about 4 days because there is that incubation period. Let's see, the last thing that we have is inhalation exposure. And like I said, this was pretty much only found in laboratories because of aerosols and whatnot. It leads to the rapid onset of flaccid paralysis and pulmonary failure. So this is actually a concern if you look on things like the CDC or kind of more government websites pertaining to microbiology. You're going to see it listed under a big threat for bioterrorism because of that rapid onset, and it's got a very high mortality rate. So as far as the treatment for Clostridium botulinum, when the environment becomes right for the pathogen, it will release its neurotoxins. So it's good that it has the endospores because it's going to have to fight a lot of our natural body defenses. But when it's ready and comes out of its vegetative state, it will release those neurotoxins that's going to travel to the peripheral synapses. Antibodies will try and fight the neurotoxin and initiate opsonization. Let's see, the antigens that come off of Clostridium botulinum would be classified under exogenous antigens, and those are the ones that deal with the toxins and other secretions and parts of the microbe, such as cell walls, membranes, the endospore. So it's an exogenous antigen that Clostridium botulinum would be. The treatment for botulism is going to be by it's an antitoxin injection. You're going to see this is hard to pronounce, metronidazole and penicillin. In extreme cases, you're going to see ventilatory support because, again, they do get that paralysis of the pulmonary function, and that's to reduce mortality, so that is an extreme situation. Metronidazole is going to be cytotoxic to Clostridium botulinum because it is a facultative anaerobic bacteria. Metronidazole works against those facultative anaerobic bacteria, and they enter into the microorganism and they reduce the activation of that neurotoxin. So the other one is penicillin. It prevents the cross-linking of those peptoglycan layers, so it's eventually going to lead to a weaker wall in the next generation, not necessarily the cells that already exist in the body, but when they go to reproduce, they're going to have weaker walls, and that's going to create holes and not too much integrity with their structure, so it's going to lead to osmotic lysis. So I talked about the antitoxin. It's going to be a trivalent botulinum antitoxin, and it's going to bind to those neurotoxins that are free and circulating in the bloodstream. So it's more of a, not preventative, but they do have to catch the neurotoxins that haven't already been bound to the peripheral nervous system. Concerning virulence mechanisms and other factors with Clostridium botulinum, it works, the virulence factor is going to be the toxic activity. The endospores can contribute vastly to the pathogenicity for the reasons I explained, being able to survive acidic environments in our bodies, such as our stomach, or extreme temperatures when we talk about canning. Botulinum, like I said, uses the toxin route. Really, the disease is prevented by destroying the spores when you're canning your own food or when you're entrusting a company to be selling you safe food. You don't want that germination to happen. So destroying the pathogen before even ingesting it or whatnot is kind of the key. I've already explained the treatments that go on. So again, it's commonly isolated in soil and water samples throughout the world, and the US eats a lot of canned foods, more so than other countries. But the most common, again, is infant botulism for the reasons explained. As far as inhalation and the wound root and virulence, it does have a rapid onset because of those spores and toxic activity. So a lot of this information concerning virulence actually came from a YouTube video I watched by Neha Chug of CSU in 2012, and that's my presentation on Clostridium botulinum. Thanks.